And also, just one question about your time with working for the senator. Um, that was obviously the era of the Red Scare and McCarthyism. Living in Washington and working in Washington at that time, was that palpable? Do you have any memories of that
I
atmosphere?
I would say no.
Okay.
I would say no. Nothing significant. The only other members of the committee that I remember to this day were a senator named Joseph O'Mahony from Wyoming and a senator named Langer from either North or South Dakota. But I don't remember any significant runoff from the McCarthy era, which, as you say, was probably prevalent at that time. I just don't recall that it affected our committee's work at all.
Okay. So tell me a little bit about your work. You started in July of '56, you said?
I did.
What kind of cases were you working on?
Well,
or clients?
it was a firm that was primarily a corporate firm. There was a litigation partner named Lloyd McMahon who went on to become a federal judge, and I think early on I worked closely with him. He was very kind. He came to my swearing in when I was sworn into the Supreme Court of New Jersey. But Lloyd McMahon at the time had been the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York, and one of the first cases I worked on with him was a stockholder's suit against the Cuba Railroad Company, which strangely was a New Jersey corporation, operated the main railroad in Cuba, was a public company, and we were outside counsel. They were sued by stockholders, and we hired the two Newark law firms, Pitney, Harden, and Kipp, and Stryker, Tams, and Dill to help us. And I worked on that case with Judge McMahon. There was a major lawsuit against the General Dynamics Corporation, having to do with whether or not they were obligated to lease 25 floors in a building on Park Avenue based on a memorandum signed by a vice president. Big case that took a lot of our time. I did a lot of the research. It was a case pending in the New York courts. Because we represented the George Fuller Construction Company, a company that built the United Nations building and the Seagram's building and the Citibank building. They were also a public company. We had a stockholder's suit by a stockholder who wanted to inspect their books and records, and we represented the corporation. And I recall, a lot of research, a lot of work on that case. As I stayed at the firm, I branched out, and the firm assigned me work in the corporate field. So I was doing corporate registration statements in connection with public offerings and proxy statements in connection with annual stockholders meetings. And then when I was about 26, say I was there 3 years, because I started there just after my 23rd birthday, I got a call one day from the senior partner. His name was Henry Marx. Middle name was Mosler because his mother was an heiress of the Mosler Safe Company. And Henry Marx was sort of a patrician, a guy. His father had made a lot of money in the South in real estate. Henry had gone to Princeton and Harvard and wore custom-made suits and custom-made shirts. And very smart man. And it was Henry Marx who passed on to me his practice of reading all kinds of sophisticated journals. He would read Foreign Affairs, which I still read to this day. He would read The Economist. He would read the Times in the morning and do the crossword puzzle in ink. He would read law reviews from Harvard and Yale and Columbia. Very well read, very sophisticated guy, and a great lawyer. So his secretary called me one morning and said, "Mr. Marx wants to see you." And in those days, when Mr. Marx wanted to see you, you went down there with your legal pad and your pen ready to take orders. Mm-hmm. And I walked into a room full of suits, none of whom I knew. And Henry Marx said to one of the guys, whose name was Charlie Fitzmaurice, "Charlie, this is Gary Stein. He's one of our brightest young men, and he's going to handle this deal for you." And Charlie Fitzmaurice took one look at me and he said, "Like hell he is." He said, "If you assign me to that kid, I'm going to Cravath." Cravath, Swain and Moore was one of the great New York firms. Henry said, "Charlie, calm down. I don't mean that Gary's going to do it himself. I'll work with him every step of the way. But, I can't be there all the time, so I just wanted you to know that when I'm not available, Gary's going to be doing the work." And Charlie calmed down. And that began a, say, 30-year relationship between me and Charlie Fitzmaurice, who, with a group of friends, was buying a controlling interest in a supermarket chain in the Midwest, in Iowa, Illinois, and Missouri, called the Benner Tea Company. Charlie was a mercurial Irishman whose father had been the police commissioner of Chicago and whose mother was from the Scott family. That was the family that owned the Carson, Peary, and Scott department stores in Chicago. And Charlie was just about as ornery and difficult a client as any lawyer could possibly have. Early on in our relationship, he called me and asked me to prepare a contract for somebody. The next day, the phone rang, and I answered it, and it was Charlie, and he said, "Where's the contract?" I said, "Gee, Mr. Fitzmaurice, I'm just finishing it." He said, "That's not acceptable. When I ask you for a contract, I want it here the next day." Now, there were no faxes in 1959, and there was no email or PDFs. There wasn't even a Federal Express. Mm-hmm. So I said, "Well, Mr. Fitzmaurice, how do I do that?" He said, "That's your problem." He said, I want my stuff out here immediately, no delays." So we used to send a messenger out to LaGuardia Airport with Charlie's contracts, and he would put it on the United Airlines freight plane that went every day from LaGuardia to O'Hare Airport so Charlie could get his stuff on time. But I learned to work with him. I learned that there was a method to his madness. He believed that you didn't let grass grow under your feet if you wanted to complete a transaction. I helped him with the acquisition of Benner Tea Company. The closing took place in Burlington, Iowa, where the company was headquartered. And the lawyer for the Benner Tea Company, Ed Daly, had an office on the second floor of a building on Main Street in Burlington. And when we went upstairs for the closing, Ed said to me, "Look, Gary, could you take your clients out for a walk?" It was the middle of February. He said, "I want to read the contract out loud to my clients. And when I'm done, I'll pull the shade up. That's how you'll know to come back up." So Charlie and I and a bunch of his stockholders went outside in the bitter Iowa cold and walked up and down Main Street until Ed Daly pulled up the shade. And we went up there and completed the closing. And I did the work for Charlie at Benner Tea Company for the next number of years that I stayed with the law firm. I started there in 1956. I left in 1966, except in 1961, when Ed and I had our first two children, Jill, my oldest daughter, and Carrie, my second daughter. I got a notice from the White House that said that President Kennedy, in response to the Russians building the Berlin Wall in 1961, and he was in his first year as president, he wanted to show President Khrushchev that he was tough. So he called up 1 million reservists. And at that time, I was in the reserves. I have to go back to explain that I took off 6 months, probably in 1958, to go on active duty in Fort Dix, and I joined the New Jersey National Guard, which gave me a 5.5-year reserve obligation. And I probably need to go back after I tell you about the 61 experience, but because it was in the National Guard that I met Governor Kean for the first time. But in 61, I got a notice to report to Fort Bragg in 3 weeks. So I spent a year, better part of a year, away from the firm from September 61, say till August 62. My son Michael was born in Fort Bragg in May in Fayetteville. And the law firm was really wonderful because they made up the difference between my Army pay as a corporal and the salary that I was earning at the firm. So whatever the difference was, they paid the difference. So I was away for the firm then, but the earlier time I had left the firm was in, I think, 58, when I first enlisted in the New Jersey National Guard. And I went to, I had a 6-month active duty requirement. I went to Fort Dix for basic training. They sent me to radio operator school, and I finished my 6 months at Fort Dix. Governor Kean and I are unsure whether we met each other at Fort Dix because he also did a 6-month active duty stint. But both of us had a 5.5-year continuing obligation with the New Jersey National Guard. That meant that you attended meetings once a week at your National Guard unit. Mine was in Jersey City. The statewide unit was the 50th Armored Division, and I used to go to drills at the Jersey City Armory on Montgomery Street on Wednesday night. And that obligation included a 2-week active duty assignment every summer at Camp Drum in Watertown, New York. And so every summer, beginning in 1959 and continuing for the next several years, I would go with the New Jersey National Guard to Camp Drum for 2 weeks active duty. I was assigned up there, probably because I was a lawyer, but not an officer, to the Public Information Office. And there was another young corporal assigned to the Public Information Office, and his name was Tom Kean. And so we got to know each other. We were in the same barracks several summers. There was nothing about him that made you think he was going to be governor of New Jersey, and I'm sure there was nothing about me that made him think I was going to be a Supreme Court justice. We were just two corporals in rumpled fatigues. The one thing that stood out about Tom Kean was that he had a hard time getting out the barracks in the morning in time for the first formation, and so he took his combat boots into town and had them customized so that he didn't have to lace them up. He had a zipper put in the combat boots so he could zip up his combat boots in the morning while the rest of us were lacing ours up and tying them and save a couple of minutes. But the day that I was sworn in as a justice of the Supreme Court, Tom spoke fondly of the times that we were at Camp Drum together, picking up cigarette butts outside of the barracks, which was a common chore assigned to young soldiers in those days. And Tom said that he and I never thought that when we were picking up cigarette butts outside the barracks, we would wind up where we were. It turned out that even though we were young guys in our 20s, we had a common interest in public affairs. And I think our friendship bonded because of that. At the time, I was working at 29 Broadway in Lower Manhattan. And Tom was working for a family investment banking firm by the name of Kane Taylor. And I think he was somewhere on Wall Street. So we were just a couple of blocks from each other. So during the year, between our summer camp engagements, we would meet for lunch. Neither of us were thrilled with what we were doing. I didn't particularly like being a young associate at a law firm with a bunch of partners telling me what to do. And he wasn't thrilled being in the family investment banking business. And we both talked about how we were going to break away. The path he took was to leave and go up to the private school that he had attended as a kid, St. Marx, and he joined the faculty there, probably in the late 50s, early 60s. The way I escaped Wall Street, and you have to understand that Ed and I had, 4 children in 5 years. So Jill was born in 1958. She's my oldest daughter, now lives in Montclair, and has been a school teacher in North Bergen for the past 30 years. She's the mother of 4 of my grandchildren, Molly, Max, Julia, and Emily. Carrie, my second daughter, was born in 1959. Carrie lives in Los Angeles. 2 of my grandchildren are there. Nick, a baseball player, and Cece, a budding Hollywood star, I'm sure. In 1961, Michael was born. And Mike is married to Ellen, and they live in Montclair. They have 3 children. Samantha, who's graduating college in Minnesota this June. Nicole, who goes to a school in Hoboken. Jacob, who goes to Montclair High School. My daughter Terry was born in 1963. She lives in Greenwich, married to David Kaplan. They have 4 children. Jesse, who's graduating Tulane this June. Rafe, who's a sophomore at Bucknell. Marley, who just got into Duke. And Jolie, who's a sophomore at Greenwich High. And my daughter Jo was born in 1969. But by the 60s, Ed and I had our hands full. And I wasn't thrilled commuting to New York an hour and 15 minutes, an hour and a half each way. Sometimes I would go by bus, sometimes by train, worked late a lot, very demanding hours. And I was interested in other opportunities. And then one day Ed came home from a League of Women Voters meeting and said to me, "You know, Gary, I have a friend at the League of Women Voters named Alice Olick, who's a lady I hang out with today. And Alice said, you should run for mayor of Paramus." The mayor of Paramus at the time was a guy named Fred Galda, and he was a Democrat, which under ordinary circumstances would have been my choice of political parties. But Fred had been the mayor for 10 years, and nobody could beat him. And a lot of people in Paramus were not happy with Fred as the mayor. He had kind of authoritarian ways. He went on to become a judge, and a very well-respected criminal judge across the street in Bergen County. But Ed said that Alice said to her that I should run against him because the thought was that I would be a fresh face, untainted by local politics, and perhaps I could beat Fred Galda. Well, the idea appealed to me because it occurred to me that maybe that was a way that eventually I could set up an office for my firm in New Jersey and not commute 3 hours a day. So I began to get active in Paramus politics, which was not hard to do. I went to a couple of mayor and council meetings, other board meetings, joined the local Republican club. Now, you have to understand that the Republican Party in the mid-'60s was entirely different from the Republican Party today. There's a picture of me over on the wall with Clifford Case, who was the Republican senator from New Jersey in those days. And Clifford Case would be a liberal today. He would be a left-wing liberal Democrat. But in those days, there were moderate and liberal Republicans like Tom Kean's father, Robert Kean, who had been my congressman when I lived in Irvington, Nelson Rockefeller, William Scranton, the governor of Pennsylvania, Jacob Javits, the Republican senator from New York, John Lindsay, the mayor of New York, George Romney, Mitt Romney's father, the governor of Michigan. So being a Republican in those days didn't seem to me to be uncomfortable or a betrayal of my family or my fundamental values. It just seemed to be an expedient way to run for mayor against Fred Galda. I would have preferred to have registered as a Democrat, but it didn't strike me as a sin. And so I joined the Republican organization. I began to make friends and meet people there. And then when the time came to file for the primary election in 1964, I did. And I ran in the Republican primary against an Irish policeman from Paramus named Dennis Buckley, and I won. Officer Buckley and his supporters were not happy, so they immediately took control of the local Republican organization, putting me in an awkward position. And some very nice, dear, good friends, including Charlie Reed, who went on to be the mayor of Paramus and a freeholder and a legislator later on, joined with me, and we formed a new Republican organization. I got a nice editorial from the Bergen Record encouraging me, and I ran in the general election, and it turned out that Mayor Galda stepped down, and he decided not to run. The Democrats nominated a lawyer from Lyndhurst named Bob Nglima, whom I know well, and who was much more conservative than I was, so we were really in the wrong parties in those days. But 1964, if you remember, was the Goldwater-Johnson election, and it was a Johnson landslide, and Republican candidates all over the country got beat, and so did I, by a substantial margin. But it was a wonderful experience. It was the first time that I'd gotten on my feet to give speeches. It was the first time that I thought that maybe I had some leadership potential. It was the first time that I'd begun to take seriously policy issues, even on a local level. I voted for Lyndon Johnson. Had I had the good sense to say that, maybe I would have lost by less, but I still would have lost. But that turned out to be a transitional step in my career.